AITA for refusing to pay for electricity because my neighbor and landlord connected to my meter. So, this all started a couple of weeks ago when I got my electricity bill and nearly choked on my coffee. It was ridiculously high. I mean, I knew energy prices had gone up, but this was beyond anything I had expected. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment. I work long hours, so I am barely home, and when I am, I only use my laptop, a couple of lamps, and a space heater in the winter. I do not even cook that much. But somehow, my bill was higher than my friend Matt's, who owns a 4-bedroom house, has 3 kids who practically live in front of the TV, and runs his washing machine and dishwasher every other day. At first, I assumed there had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a meter misread, a clerical error, something. So I called the electric company, expecting them to tell me they had overcharged me and would issue a correction. Instead, they pulled up my account and said the readings were accurate. They even had a technician check remotely, confirming that my apartment was indeed pulling a ridiculous amount of power. I argued with them, asking how that could be possible, but as far as they were concerned, everything was in order. Frustrated, I decided to do some investigating on my own. I shut off every single appliance in my apartment, unplugged everything from the walls, even turned off the breaker. Then, I went down to check the meter. It was still spinning. Fast. I am talking, I run a small factory out of my living room fast. At that moment, I knew something was very wrong. There was no way my apartment was drawing that much power when everything was shut off. I needed a second opinion, so I called my friend who is an electrician. He came over the next evening, and we went through everything together. He confirmed that, yes, my meter was running way faster than it should be. Then, he started looking around to see where the power was going. That is when we found it. A second connection. A line running out of my breaker box, leading through the wall and into my neighbor's apartment. I could not believe it. My neighbor had somehow connected his place to my meter and had been stealing power from me. And judging by the amount, it was not a small amount either. This was not just a lamp and a phone charger, this was major usage. Possibly his entire apartment. I confronted him that night. I knocked on his door, and the second he opened it, I could tell he knew why I was there. I told him what I had found, and his reaction was pure, calculated shock. Oh, I had no idea. That must be some kind of mistake. He even had the nerve to act like he was just as confused as I was. I was not buying it. There was no way this was accidental. Someone had physically run a connection from his unit to mine. This was not something that just happened randomly. I told him he needed to fix it immediately, or I was reporting him. That was when I started thinking about how this was even possible in the first place. This was not just some extension cord situation. This had to have been done by someone with at least some knowledge of electrical wiring. And why had I never noticed this before? Had this been going on since I moved in? Was I paying for his electricity for months, maybe even years? I decided to take it up with my landlord. His name is Gary, and he is exactly the kind of landlord you are probably picturing right now. Older guy, always acting like he is too busy to deal with problems, but somehow always around when rent is due. I went to his office the next morning and explained the situation. I told him what the electrician had found, how my neighbor was literally stealing my power, and how I wanted something done about it immediately. Gary put on his best, concerned landlord face and said, "Wow, that is really strange. I had no idea. I will look into it." But something about the way he said it felt off. Then, not even a day later, he started pressuring me to just let it go. Maybe you and your neighbor can work something out. No need to make a big deal out of it. You know, these things happen. I could not believe what I was hearing. My own landlord was trying to sweep this under the rug. That is when I knew something was really wrong. I told him no. There was no way I was just letting this go. I had already been overcharged hundreds of dollars, maybe more. I was not paying for someone else's power, and I was not going to just work it out with the guy who had literally been robbing me. I reported it to the electric company immediately. That was when things got even weirder. The second I made the report, my family, yes, my own family, started calling me, telling me I was overreacting. My mom, my uncle, even my cousin, who I barely talked to, all had something to say. It is just a few extra dollars. You are making a big deal out of nothing. You are putting your housing at risk. Are you sure you did not just read it wrong? I was pissed. Here I was, literally getting stolen from, and instead of people having my back, they were acting like I was the problem. But I knew I was right. And I was not backing down. Then came the first real twist. The electric company sent someone out to check the connections and verify my report. They confirmed that, yes, my neighbor had tapped into my meter. They disconnected him immediately, but while they were there, they noticed something else. There was still another connection that was not mine. Now I was confused. My apartment only had one neighboring unit, and we had already found that one connection. The place on the other side of me was empty. No one had lived there for months. The electrician followed the line. It ran out of the building and across the street. Update 1. The electrician followed the line. It ran out of the building and across the street. I stood there, staring at that cable, my mind struggling to keep up with what my eyes were seeing. The cold evening air felt sharper against my skin as the weight of this new discovery settled in. Across the street? That didn't make any sense. I went over the possibilities in my head, each one more ridiculous than the last. Maybe it was an old, forgotten line. Maybe the previous tenants had something installed years ago. Maybe. No. There was no maybe. This was live. This was active. That line was still draining power, my power, and it was leading away from my apartment like a lifeline feeding some unseen parasite. I started following it, step by step, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The buildings on this block were mostly businesses, a laundromat, a cafe, a few small shops. None of them should have had any reason to be siphoning electricity from a random apartment across the street. And yet, the line kept going, running from my building, across the street, and straight into a house. Not just any house. My landlord's house. I stopped dead in my tracks. The realization hit like a freight train. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring, unable to fully process what I was seeing. A sick, crawling feeling spread through my stomach. It felt like a bad dream, like some twisted joke the universe had decided to play on me. Gary. The same landlord who had brushed me off. The same guy who had tried to convince me that this wasn't a big deal. The same guy who had practically begged me to just let it go. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The slow burn of pure, unfiltered rage started deep in my chest and worked its way outward, filling every part of me. This wasn't just some lazy oversight. This wasn't some accident. This was deliberate. Gary had been living his entire life on my dime. Every light in his house, every appliance, every warm shower, every movie night on what was probably a giant, high-definition TV, all of it had been powered by me. His big-screen TV. His dishwasher. His laundry. His refrigerator. His heating and cooling. For how long? Months? Years? I thought back to every time I had turned my heat down to save a little on my bill, every time I had unplugged something I wasn't using, every time I had shivered under a blanket in the winter because I didn't want to waste energy. Meanwhile, this man was living like a king on my money. That was when I snapped. I didn't hesitate. I didn't stop to think. I called the power company again, my fingers shaking with pure adrenaline. This wasn't just some shady neighbor skimming a little power. This was major. I gave them everything, the photos, the meter readings, the electrician's findings. But I didn't stop there. I filed a formal complaint with the city. I was done. No more being patient. No more back and forth. No more waiting around for someone else to handle it. I was taking control of this situation, and I was making sure everyone knew exactly what Gary had been doing. But I wasn't finished. Because I wanted to see the look on his face when I told him. I marched straight to his office, the anger bubbling inside me so strong I could taste it. I threw open the door, and the second he saw me, I knew. He knew. I laid it all out in front of him. I told him exactly what I had found, how the electric company knew, how the city would know soon enough. I told him that if he didn't fix this immediately, I was taking legal action. And that was when the real fun began. First, he tried to act confused. Like this was some big misunderstanding, some clerical error. He had the nerve to sit there, rubbing his chin, pretending to think, as if an entire house could just magically connect to a tenant's meter without anyone knowing. Oh wow, I had no idea. That's crazy, man. Must have been some mix-up with the wiring. I wasn't buying it. Then, he switched tactics. Guilt. He leaned back in his chair, shook his head like he was the real victim here. Look, man, times are tough. I'm just trying to get by, same as you. You don't understand how hard it is to keep a place like this running. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to throw something. I understood perfectly. I understood that I had been getting robbed for who knows how long. While I was worried about my bill, he was living his best life, completely free. When guilt didn't work, he got angry. The mask slipped. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. You're making a big mistake. You keep pushing this, you're gonna regret it. That was when he played his final card, the eviction threat. He sat back, arms crossed, like he had already won. You're causing trouble. Stirring up unnecessary problems. If you don't let this go, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. The thing is, he couldn't do a damn thing. I had everything in writing. I had documentation. I had a formal complaint filed. I had an open case with the city. Even if he tried to evict me, it would be straight-up retaliation. Illegal. And that was when something happened that I wasn't expecting. Because the electric company, they took this very seriously. This wasn't just about my bill anymore. What Gary had done wasn't just shady or unethical, it was straight-up fraud. Utility theft is a crime. And, because of how far this had gone, the power company wasn't just going to cut him off. They were going to press charges. Then came the second twist. Update 2. The city inspector came out. I knew things were bad, but I didn't know just how bad until I watched him walk through my building, his face growing more and more serious with every step. He wasn't just here for the stolen electricity anymore. This had escalated into something much bigger. The moment he stepped inside, it was like watching a professional crime scene investigator, except instead of blood and fingerprints, he was cataloging every single violation in the building. Gary wasn't just a slumlord. He was operating an entirely illegal rental property. I don't mean, oh, there are some zoning issues. I mean this building was never supposed to be rented out in the first place. No proper permits. No adherence to housing codes. No legal right to have tenants living here at all. The inspector went room by room, checking the wiring, the insulation, the structure itself. It didn't take him long to find problem after problem. There was improper wiring throughout the building, which explained why it was so easy for Gary to reroute electricity to his own house. It wasn't just me, every apartment was at risk. The breaker boxes were a mess of tangled, overloaded circuits, and the insulation in the walls was either non-existent or so poorly installed that it might as well have been an old blanket stuffed inside. Then came the real kicker, he had no permits for anything. Not the electrical work, not the plumbing, not even the original conversion that turned this place into rental units. It was never supposed to be divided up into separate apartments. It had no official records as a multifamily property. As far as the city was concerned, it was still a single structure, never approved for occupancy in the way Gary had set it up. He had been illegally renting out apartments for years. This wasn't just a case of shady landlord behavior. This was full-blown fraud. The inspector wasted no time. He started taking photos, filling out paperwork, and making phone calls. It was clear that this wasn't something that was going to get brushed under the rug. The city wasn't just annoyed, they were pissed. Gary had been collecting rent for years without paying the proper taxes, without following any safety regulations, without even filing a single legal document to register the building as multi-unit housing. He had effectively been running an underground rental business while avoiding every possible law designed to protect tenants. The fines started stacking up immediately. They weren't small, either. The city hit him with violations so severe that even my insanely high electric bill looked like pocket change in comparison. First, there were the immediate code violations. The lack of permits. The dangerous wiring. The uninsulated walls. Then there were fire hazards. If a fire had broken out, it would have spread instantly because the walls weren't properly constructed between units. There were no fire barriers, no smoke detectors in some apartments, and the emergency exits were either blocked or completely non-existent. Then came the legal side. The city started digging into his records, and things only got worse. He had no rental licenses. No proof of inspections. No history of compliance with basic housing laws. He had somehow been getting away with this for years, flying under the radar, renting out an illegal property while pocketing tens of thousands of dollars in rent money. And now? Now he was completely screwed. The moment the city got involved, Gary's whole operation started collapsing. The fines were so outrageous that even if he liquidated every asset he had, he still wouldn't be able to cover them all. The city didn't just fine him, they put him on the fast track for legal action. He was looking at tens of thousands of dollars in penalties before even getting to the fact that he had stolen electricity and committed utility fraud. By this point, word had spread. The other tenants in the building, people who had lived their way longer than me, started coming forward with their own horror stories. Leaks that never got fixed. Broken heaters in the winter. Mold growing in the walls. One guy had a ceiling cave in from water damage, and instead of repairing it properly, Gary just stapled a plastic sheet over the hole and called it a day. The city was not happy. And neither were his other tenants. Some of them had been paying higher rents than legal because Gary had lied about the place being registered. Some had been forced to live in unsafe conditions because he refused to fix anything properly. Now that they knew the truth, they started lawyering up. Gary, who had spent so much effort trying to convince me that this was no big deal, was now facing multiple lawsuits, thousands of dollars in fines, and possible criminal charges. At this point, my family had gone from calling me an overreacting to being completely silent. Funny how that works. Update 3. Gary got arrested. By the time the city had finished peeling back the layers of his scam, it was like watching someone tug on a loose thread and unravel an entire tapestry of fraud, negligence, and straight-up crime. Every time they uncovered one thing, it led to another, a tangled mess of illegal activity that he had been carefully burying for years. It turned out the illegal rentals and the electricity theft were just the tip of the iceberg. Once the city started digging into his records, they found more. At first, they focused on the most obvious violations, the illegal wiring, the lack of permits, the dangerous living conditions he had forced tenants to endure. That alone was enough to bury him under a mountain of fines and legal trouble. But then they started combing through his financials, looking for any signs of misreporting, and that was when they hit the motherlode. Gary had been collecting government benefits for what he claimed was a low-income household. A household that, of course, was powered by my meter. For years, he had been feeding off public assistance, presenting himself as struggling to make ends meet while simultaneously raking in full-price rent from multiple tenants in a building that technically wasn't even supposed to exist. He had been applying for subsidies, tax breaks, and utility assistance programs designed to help people in actual financial distress, all while running a completely illegal rental operation. The same guy who told me times were tough and that I should just let things go had been lying to the government to get financial aid while stealing electricity from me. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. It was one thing to be a slumlord. It was one thing to be a scammer. But to do both at the same time, while lying to both his tenants and the government, was another level of shameless. He wasn't just stealing from me, he was stealing from everyone. When the fraud investigators got involved, things escalated fast. This wasn't just about unpaid fines or unpermitted renovations anymore. This was serious criminal activity. The city had already built a strong case against him, but now, with the fraud charges stacking up, his entire financial existence was about to be torn apart. His accounts were audited, his previous tax filings scrutinized, his government benefit applications pulled up and reviewed line by line. It turned out that none of this was new for him. He had been pulling stunts like this for years, hopping from loophole to loophole, dodging inspections, avoiding fines by changing mailing addresses, even registering properties under different names to avoid being tracked. He had multiple outstanding violations in other places, unresolved complaints from former tenants, and more than a few angry landlords, contractors, and city officials who had been waiting for him to finally go down. Between the city fines, the fraud investigation, and the now multiple lawsuits from tenants who had been living in unsafe conditions, it was only a matter of time before law enforcement stepped in. The day Gary got arrested, I didn't see it happen in person, but I heard about it immediately. The other tenants were practically buzzing with excitement, spreading the news like wildfire. The cops showed up at his house, the same house he had powered on my dime, and hauled him out in cuffs. One of the tenants actually managed to take a blurry phone video from across the street. The sight of him standing there, hands behind his back, being shoved into the back of a police car. Chef's kiss. Turns out the fraud charges alone were enough to land him in serious trouble. But when you added in utility theft, illegal rentals, tax evasion, and the landlord-tenant violations, he wasn't just in trouble. He was screwed. Meanwhile, I suddenly found myself in an unexpected position, a victim of fraud. I had been unknowingly paying for someone else's utilities, living in an unregistered, unsafe apartment, and financially harmed as a result. The city wasn't just shutting Gary down, they were making sure that the people affected weren't left stranded. Since my rental agreement had technically been void the entire time, I had been residing in a fraudulent lease, which meant I was legally entitled to compensation and assistance. I was relocated, by the city, to a much better apartment. A real one. One that was actually up to code. One with legitimate insulation, proper wiring, and a landlord who wasn't a cartoon villain siphoning off electricity like some 1920s grifter. The city even assisted me with the transition, covering part of my move-in costs because, legally, I had been a tenant in an unlivable situation. I went from fighting to get my electricity bill fixed to a complete upgrade in my living situation. And my old building? Shut down. Completely. The tenants who had lived there for years were either relocated or given financial assistance to find another place. Some of them even started legal proceedings against Gary, because it turned out I wasn't the only one he had been screwing over. Some of them had been paying higher rents than legal, some had been denied basic repairs, and some had been forced to live in dangerous conditions while Gary ignored them. Now that the truth was out, they weren't about to let him get away with it. And my family? The same people who had spent weeks telling me I was overreacting, causing trouble, making a big deal out of nothing. Now they were saying things like, "Wow, good thing you caught that," and acting as if they hadn't been calling me dramatic just a week ago.